Talk to me a bit about the global aspects here. So
Yes.
I know you've got a lot of experience on an international level. Any interesting insights you can share?
Yeah, so it's very interesting. There are companies tackling this problem, and that problem is, and you just hit the nail on the head. The problem is quite unique in the US and potentially Canada, because there is still some fragmentation there, in that basically, not every city uses the full traditional the US-based zoning and land use model. The UK has more of a land use based sort of case law model, and there's some tech players already there that are doing some great stuff there with the guys at Land Tech and doing some great things with that over there. In Australia, I've had some experience with that in a partnership that we did with CoreLogic Australia and getting that information out to the 15,000 professionals that we service there. The issue was very different in Australia because, as you pointed out, we've got this fragmentation in the US, whereas in Australia it was much easier to be able to, the data capture problem wasn't as big of a problem because we could literally go to the state governments and get a standardized data set across all the cities in a particular state. Unlike here in the US, where it's, when I came over here to sort of tackle the problem, my wife is from New York and she wanted to return home, and that's when I started sort of looking around saying, what's the problem like here in the US? And when I really got my head around it, how big it was, the fragmentation of the data was such an issue. But another thing about the sort of globally, Africa, there's a number of African nations like Kenya and Nigeria that have used zoning to restrict and control land use. Some Asian countries that do it, and then there are some European countries that use zoning, but they're more of a UK-based sort of similar model where it's less prescriptive control of land use and density, and more of an outcome-based and use of case law to do it. So zoning is sort of not a universal thing. It was really developed out of the US. It's really a US urban planning movement that was adopted by Canada and Australia to a large extent, and some African countries and some European countries, but it's not universal that zoning is used to control land use and regulation.
Talking about the philosophy, why is zoning? Why did this movement come? What was the problem they were solving? Because for a lot of people, anything involving processes is bureaucracy, which is like, I hate it. I just want to get things done, right? But what was the reason that society brought about this concept of land use and zoning data?
Yeah, so it's very much what UK, you had like a sort of a planned gardens and planned garden movement and planned real estate movement and sort of urban town planning in the UK was sort of where that developed out, but it sort of merged into a different format, which we just expressed. But the real traditional, just straight prescriptive zoning comes out of the US movement and was really about environmental, from an environmental point of view, basically being able to make sure that your housing wasn't right next to the factory that was pumping out smog and also sanitation.
Polluting your water,
Yes, exactly. So that was that. And then we sort of had the sprawl element in the car, and then we were actually building towns out of straight from farms. And so this planned restrictive being able to say, okay, we want our industrial over here, our commercial over here, our residential over here, and we want to split them up. And we've since learned things, urban planners, there's always a new movement about sort of trying to think better about how we live, and maybe that wasn't so right to split everything up, and it didn't allow for permeability or places that people found that were lively and fun and encouraged investment. That's why we still go back to these cities like New York, where a lot of the development took place pre-zoning, or Boston pre-zoning, because we still mix those uses. So we're learning better things about how to zone, not so prescriptive, and there's different models with that. There is, though, There also is a bit of a darker side to zoning, and I guess a less. There is a movement. There is some investigations in the fact that it may have been used for not just discriminating against certain land uses that you wanted to take place to keep the industrial away from the residential, but it also may have been used in many cases as a way of being prejudiced against minority communities in certain areas. And there's documented evidence of it being utilized in certain ways. Hopefully not as much in zoning codes today, but maybe in previous codes around the 1920s and the 50s, where it was used, sort of like how redlining may have been used, but also how zoning could have been utilized to sort of prevent low cost housing and affordable housing, and also restrict certain things. So that was something that is actually being looked at heavily right now, and doing a lot of investigation into whether single family zoning is some sort of being utilized as a causing some prejudice.
We had Jeff Wilson, the founder and CEO of Jupe, on an earlier episode or show, where we talked about this as one of the problems that exist, and sort of the inherent racism in zoning and real estate. So I encourage people to search for that. Jupe, Jeff Wilson, PropTech VC podcast. Go on YouTube or Spotify or wherever you can find it. But there is a dark side indeed. Now, staying on the more optimistic route here, where do you think, could be any place, could be any state, right? Where has zoning been done well? Could you give an example? And related to that, what is the right way for zoning to be in terms of the policies and the way it's done? Could you sort of walk us through your philosophy, and can you give an example?
Yeah, so there's a number of different philosophies. So there's prescriptive zoning, and then there's ULID zoning, and so there's a number of different ways that we zone now. And it really depends on the city's needs and dynamics. One new code that was adopted that's very forward-thinking is the City of Miami proper's new zoning code that they adopted in the recent years. And what it allows is it's less focused on keeping your industrial development away from your residential and your single family and your commercial, and then it's more focused on outcome and keeping your densities to the way that you want to keep it in a particular city. So certain heights will obviously keep in the higher, the tower buildings you want to keep in the CBD corporate area, but if you have a precinct that's maybe underutilized, you could keep a mixed use, and maybe it won't be as dense as in the more traditional areas where you'd expect a mixed use building, but it will liven up that area and allow for more revitalization of the city. So, I'm not saying that Miami City was zoned properly from the beginning, but they're doing some inroads into making it the way it should be. Seattle's another one that's very forward thinking in the way that they are zoning for redevelopment, and also being in touch with where the community wants and how to make a livable city.
Thank you for sharing that.
And just to back, but the one thing they have to look at is a small village or town that doesn't have the population that you would have of a Seattle or a Miami. They're going to they don't have the same zoning demands and needs of a city like Miami or Seattle. So it really depends on the needs of the city.
So shifting to a different topic now, when we look at sort of the technology involved in a company like Zoneomics, one key thing we haven't talked about on any episodes yet is this concept of GIS, right?
Yeah.
GIS is something, and maybe I'll let you define it for us, but it's critical because it's one of these technologies that really fits PropTech very well. Many use cases in real estate exist because of a geographic information system in GIS. Do you want to sort of explain to our viewers how you would describe a GIS and sort of how you're using it?
And I can it's pretty simply, they pretty much are using a GIS system every day when they go into Google Maps. I mean, it sounds pretty simplistic, but it's one of the most advanced GIS systems in the world. And that's really, to think simply, is basically being able to represent real world information digitally on a map and be able to make it usable to be able to display information. Now, we use a whole bunch of different GIS systems. There's some cloud-based. The leader in the industry is Esri, and you've got Kato, which is doing some great inroads with cloud GIS. There's some open source ones like QGIS and GrassGIS, and what it is used is to be able to perform analysis on a map-based level, so that you can determine things about that land with latitude and longitude, which is the key, is tying that data set to a lat and long, and so it's location-based, whether that be a pinpoint latitude and longitude, or whether it's a polygon, which is what we deal with both. But obviously, from a zoning map, you're talking more polygons on a map.
Esri is one of the most fascinating companies, run by a husband and wife, and they've built it to just an incredible scale, to the point where, they were competing. Google tried to compete with them once, and Esri ended up licensing and powering a lot of Google's software. Esri is just such a beautiful company in terms of how big they've become. Hundreds of thousands of customers, and powering technology for all of us. As you said, we use a GIS system every day, and these guys pretty much invented the concept of a GIS back when no one even knew what GIS would be. Beautiful story. I understand, I think they were completely bootstrapped as well. Didn't go and raise a typical funding, so it's completely family owned, which is, a dream for everyone in the technology industry. You don't need to work with investors and give up ownership. I mean, I'm a VC, I was an entrepreneur once too, but, we can add a lot of value, but as a founder, I mean, if you can do it by yourself, that's the dream, right? And
they've done it globally. Esri is just a giant in the space, absolute giant in the space.
There are use cases for GIS in every area you can think of, right? I mean, we're talking about real estate, but governments use this. You need this for looking at electricity, natural resources, your water, your gas, your manufacturing, public safety, transportation. I mean, every element, right?
Flood mapping, climate change planning and analysis. Yeah, all GIS is really a key to it, to see future-proofing land and even just delivery of infrastructure and investment.
And to dive into that a bit more, I'm fascinated by GIS because a lot of technology is very back-end focused, right? GIS is one of those things where it's very visual. You can see things, and so for anyone interested in coding and getting I've been doing this myself, right? I learned to code from scratch, self-taught, after I sold my company, by the way. So that signals to you why I'm a big proponent of technology and being hands-on on the engineering side. I ran a company, I took it to an incredible scale, eventually it exited for, hundreds of millions of dollars. One weakness was that I didn't focus enough on the engineering side. And so one thing I did was I spent a lot of time getting hands-on on engineering, taught myself some Python, and loved experimenting with the different sort of GIS technology out there. And it's beautiful, you can suddenly overlay something and put it on a map with a few lines of code. And it's very, very motivating when you're learning to code to see your results on the screen. And GIS is one of those things where it's also very easy to showcase to someone else. So in your case, you've got all this data, right? It's disparate, it's all over the place. What better thing than showing it to someone on a map where they can zoom in and they can see the zoning information by the city, by the lot, by the street, by whatever where you want to go in and out, you know?
Absolutely. And it's funny that was really my connection, because a little bit of background. Obviously, I did an urban planning degree. There's not much coding in there, but the way my into being, not a founder that wasn't completely, didn't have a tech background, but largely I usually introduce myself not really having a tech background, but GIS was my window into that, because I did it at university and then practiced with it. And you're right, you instantly are able to see what the work that you're doing on a map and so it's really a great tool to be able to work with. And it was my way into this, of when I was envisioning the problem, and GIS was my immediate way of saying, well, it's got to be a tech-based solution, and GIS was my way to see it. And that also was my connection with my co-founder, and it's how we're able to really communicate with each other. Him being both Asim Mustak is his name, him being a computer science, having a computer science degree and a GIS based degree. It's how we kind of were initially able to communicate on the same level, was through that GIS.